Adam and Eve. Before creating the first Sabbath on the seventh day, God created man and woman. According to Genesis chapter 1, God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Genesis 5:3 explains helps to interpret the meaning that man is created in the image and likeness of God. This verse states, when Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. The expression image and likeness in Genesis 1 indicates that Adam and Eve are related to God as children in an analogous way, similarity with the difference, as Seth is related to his father, Adam, as a son. That both the first man and first woman were created in the image and likeness of God means, comments Miller, that to have a full image of God, you need males and females both. A room full of men does not give you an image of God. A room full of women does not give you an image of God. If you want to know the image of God, you're going to need men and women both. End of quote. Petrie explains that it is not clear why the plural pronoun us is used. One common explanation is that God is speaking the royal we that even popes once used in formal settings. Petrie dismisses this explanation, since apart from this text, God is referred to only with a singular pronoun. Another explanation is that God is speaking to the angelic court, or, as some Jewish commentaries pose, perhaps to creation itself. The difficulty with this explanation, points out Petrie, is that man is created in the image of God and not in the image of angels or creation. A patristic explanation is that the us is a veiled reference to the Trinity that is revealed in the New Testament. For example, according to the Epistle of Barnabas, with the pronoun us, God refers to the Son. Similarly, the Apostolic Constitution states, the divine scripture testifies that God said to Christ, his only begotten, "Let us make man after our image." Genesis names the first two humans created, Adam, from the Hebrew word Adama, meaning dirt or ground, and Eve, from the Hebrew word Chava, meaning life, because she was the mother of all living. As dirt, Adam is to be the protective ground that supports his wife Eve, life, to walk on. After being created as a supportive ground, Adam is commanded to keep the garden. The English translation keep comes from the Hebrew word shamar, meaning to guard and to watch. The mutually subordinate friendship between Adam and Eve is also intended by God to be friendship that is a lifelong commitment to only one other spouse, as verse 24 indicates. Therefore, a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. After the fall, the original intention of marriage to be between one man and one woman, who become united in a lifelong friendship as one flesh, is soon forgotten, and polygamy, beginning with Lamech, a fourth-generation descendant of Cain, becomes common. How the first woman is named indicates a mutual subordinate relationship of lifelong equal friends that Adam and Eve are to live in accordance with. Adam is to be subordinate to Eve as the ground she walks on, and Eve is to be subordinate to Adam, who is to protect her by guarding the garden. In chapter 2, after Adam names the animals, he does not. He refrains from naming Eve in the same way and instead says, "She shall be called woman." In commenting on Adam's avoidance of naming the first woman, Miller writes, "If the man names the woman, then he decrees her destiny, and he owns her. The man does not name the woman. This one shall be called, passive voice. It's a grammatical attempt to avoid saying he names her." End of quote. After the fall, Adam is not as delicate in relating to his wife, the first woman, And instead of saying, "This woman shall be Eve, since she is the mother of the living," he abrogates the responsibility of naming the first woman upon himself. The man called his wife Eve, Genesis 3:20. By so doing, Miller explains, Adam names the first woman the same way he named the coyote and the raccoon. In other words, Israel acknowledges that women are oppressed. If you look at the laws, a woman is the property of her father until she's married and becomes the property of her husband, just like his plow. But Genesis 2 says startlingly, that's the way it is, but it's not what God intended. Prior to taking upon himself the role of naming the first woman, Adam repeatedly failed to fulfill his vocation to protect the garden, and consequently failed to heroically love his wife who was formed out of Adam's rib as he slept. Instead, Adam remained silent while the serpent, representing the devil, explains Petrie, subverted the family order by engaging first with Eve and not with the guardian of the garden, who is Adam. When Adam speaks, it is to blame Eve, observes Miller. I quote, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit of the tree, and I ate." A noble response would have been to acknowledge his cowardice before God, to acknowledge his choice of fearfully in silence, not protecting Eve from evil. Adam's silence is evidence, since the devil, although directing his temptation to Eve, uses the second person plural of die and eat when tempting Eve. This means that the devil was speaking to both Adam and Eve in the you plural while directing his temptation to Eve. Throughout this attack, though, Adam says not a word. Not only was Adam to guard the garden as future priests guarded the holiness of the tabernacle and later the Jerusalem temple, but he was also to fulfill a kingly role. Adam's priestly guardian role in relationship to Eden and Eve is evident, explains Hahn, in that the two Hebrew verbs in Genesis 2:15, to kill, to till, and to keep, only occur together elsewhere in the Pentateuch, where priestly duties are assigned to the Levites in the tabernacle. End of quote. In addition, Hahn points out the Garden of Eden, the tabernacle, and the temple are all described in similar ways. One early example of identifying Adam as not only a priest who is to guard Eden, but also a king who is to rule over Eden and is extend his rule over all of creation is from the Eastern monk Simeon, the new theologian. In his discourses, Simeon writes, and I quote, "In the beginning God made man king of all the things that are on the earth, indeed of all things that are under the vault of the sky. In fact, sun, moon, and stars were brought into being for man. What then? When he was king of all these visible objects, did they harm him with regard to virtue? In no way whatever. On the contrary, had he continued to give thanks to God who had made him and given him all things, he would have fared well. Had he not transgressed the commandment of his master, he would not have lost this kingship. He would not have deprived himself of the glory of God." Echoing St. Simeon and other early Christians' understanding of Adam as a king, Bishop Barron writes, Adam, and I quote, "Adam prior to the fall was interpreted not only as a priest, but also as a king, specifically a king on the march. For his purpose was not only to cultivate the garden, but also to expand its borders outward, making the whole world a place where God is correctly praised. Under this rubric, we can understand the fall as a failure in kingship. Compromise in his basic identity, Adam was no longer able to defend the garden, much less increase its empire. Consequently, he and Eve were expelled from paradise. We should read this not as an arbitrary punishment, but rather as spiritual physics. From the loss of priestly and kingly identity follows, as night follows day, the loss of the garden. The fall, of course, is described in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, and it is most instructive to read the ensuing chapters, which proffer a concentrated amount of the permutations and combinations of dysfunction that follow from the original disintegration. We find stories of corruption, violence, envy, murder, imperialistic machination, and cruelty. St. Augustine did not miss the Bible's identification of the fratricide Cain as the founder of cities, seeing in this skewing of the political order that ought to have followed from right kingship. He practically delighted in the echo of this identification in the story of Rome's founding by another fratricide. End of quote. As explained by Petrie, unlike the old Adam who is tempted by the devil with disordered pleasure, eating the forbidden fruit, with possessions, possessing the forbidden fruit, and with power, being like God in one's own terms, and fell, Jesus, as the new Adam, when faced by the variation on these threefold temptations, did not sin. After being led by the Spirit into the wilderness, Satan similarly tempted Jesus as the new Adam in a threefold manner consisting of lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and pride. Satan does so by tempting Jesus to turn stones into bread, lust of the flesh, by offering him all the kingdoms of the world, lust of the eyes, and by tempting Jesus to jump from a high point in the temple and land miraculously unharmed, pride. Jesus successfully counters each temptation with temperance, meekness, and humility. Hahn and Petrie additionally explain that Jesus' ultimate visible expression as a perfect new Adam was his willingness to die on the cross for his bride, the church. Like Adam, Jesus experienced fear of death, as is evident in Jesus' words, "Father, if you are willing, remove this chalice from me." Unlike Adam, though, Jesus immediately followed this fearful reaction with perfect submission to his heavenly Father's will. "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." With these words, Jesus indicated that although he is afraid of dying on the cross, a natural reaction of human nature, he will do so if the Father wants him to. Jesus then does so and fulfills his role of guardian, as keeper of his bride, the church, even if this means sacrificing his life for her. Then, through his death and resurrection, Jesus restores the life of grace that Adam had been called to and had lost. Adam's main sin was failing as a protector, as a defender of life, as a defender of truth against falsehood, especially against the lies that Eve was tempted with. A principal lie, identified by Benedict XVI, that Eve encountered and fell for is similar to what King David experienced when lustfully gazing upon the naked beauty of the married woman Bathsheba. Both David and Eve desired to possess and dominate the beautiful object of their desire, Bathsheba in the case of David, and the forbidden fruit that was a delight to Eve's eyes. In describing this temptation in the form of deceptive and false beauty, beauty not formed by truth, principally by the truth of sacrificial love that both Adam and Eve were called to, and not selfish, overly possessive love, Benedict XVI comments, and I quote, "Falsehood, however, has another stratagem, a beauty that is deceptive and false, a dazzling beauty that does not bring human beings out of themselves into the ecstasy of starting off towards the heights, but instead immures them completely within themselves. Such beauty does not awaken a longing for the ineffable, a willingness to sacrifice and to lose oneself, but instead stirs up the desire, the will for power, possession, and pleasure. It is that sort of experience of beauty that Genesis tells about in the account of the fall. Eve sees that the fruit of the tree is beautiful to eat and is delightful to the eyes. Beauty, as she experiences it, arouses in her a desire of possession, making her, so to speak, turn in upon herself. Like the old Adam, Eve lost her role. Eve lost her role as mother of all living, but not completely. In affirming that even Eve kept her status as mother of all in some manner, Benedict XVI asserts that Genesis 3:20 indicates Eve did not completely lose her role as mother of the living, since she's called Eve, Chava, meaning life, after the account of the fall. According to Benedict XVI, this placement implies that even after the fall, Eve retained her status of being very good and a mother of the living, but in a wounded manner that was waiting to be healed. God promises in what is called the first gospel, Protevangelium Genesis 3:15, that one day this healing will take place with the aid of a new Eve, a new woman who would fulfill her role as a perfect mother of all. She, through her seed, prophesies Genesis, will crush the head of Satan. Hamilton points out that in the Septuagint, the seed of the woman is translated into Greek as spermatos, from which the English word semen originates. This word is typically used in reference to a man, not to a woman, and yet here it is used in reference to a woman. Could this be interpreted as a subtle indication from God, who is the primary author of Scripture, of the virgin birth? By being perfectly obedient to God, Mary became the new mother of the living, who restores supernatural life to humans by her son Jesus, by her seed Jesus. Petrie explains that God out of mercy banished Adam and Eve from Eden, since if they had continued to eat from the central tree in the garden, the tree of life, they would have lived forever, but only physically, since they had lost sanctifying grace. They had lost their spiritual communion, their spiritual life that God has invited them to participate in. Jesus, according to patristic commentary, as the new tree of life by his death on the cross, restores us to sanctifying grace by baptism, represented by water flowing from his pierced side. And Jesus deepens this restoration through the Eucharist, represented by the blood flowing from his side. Banished from Eden and from eating from the old tree of life, Adam, Eve, and their descendants were at enmity with Satan, who lusted after them to consume them in accordance with Satan's curse of to eat dust all the days of your life. Petrie points out that the dust represents man, whose very name means dirt or ground, and represents that which can never satisfy Satan's lust to be like God, whose image man is created in. Eating dust well represents this insatiable desire of Satan, since dust is completely unnourishing. When Jesus takes on the flesh of man, he restores what Adam and Eve lost. Through Jesus, we once again become capable of being partakers of divine nature, as assisted by the aid of Mary, who is given through Jesus fullness of grace. The dust that Satan is condemned to lust after corresponds with the sin of enticing Eve to eat forbidden fruit. Hamilton comments that God's fitting punishment to match a sin is repeated in other passages of Genesis. God's fitting a punishment to match a sin is repeated in other passages of Genesis. For example, Cain, who once lived the life of a stable farmer, was punished with exile and condemned to a nomadic lifestyle. Saint Irenaeus teaches that Jesus and Mary fulfill Genesis 3:15, which describes a woman who together with her seed crushed the head of a serpent, representing Satan, who bites at the heel. Jesus, born of the new Eve, Mary, is the seed who crushes Satan. In his work of recapitulation, writes Irenaeus, it was fitting that Jesus as the new Adam be born of a sinless woman, since by being sinless, Mary does not fall under Satan's power, and hence is truly the mother of the living. The sinless woman, Mary, is invited by Jesus to participate in the work of redemption, of crushing Satan's head. And we, as adopted sons of God in Jesus, are also invited to participate in this work of redemption, ending Satan's kingdom while extending God's kingdom. Participating in redemption entails suffering and union with Jesus. And because of this union, because of participating Jesus' love is a suffering which has become light by love, in contrast with suffering that is heavy, absent of love, and accompanied by resentment or at least hopeless resignation. Expanding on Irenaeus' interpretation, Petrie points out that Jesus as the Redeemer, with Mary who participates in his work of redemption, dies since he is bitten by the serpent Satan prior to Jesus crushing the serpent's head. As a divine person whose human nature, which truly experiences death, Jesus rises from the dead, and through this death conquers death's agent, the devil. By rising from the dead, Jesus, the new Adam, together with Mary, the new Eve, undo the sin that the old Adam and old Eve had committed. Jesus fulfills his role as new Adam by being the perfect Redeemer, and Mary, as the true mother of the living, does so by participating in Jesus' one redemption. Jesus also fulfills his role as new Adam by giving life to the new Eve. As Eve was formed out of Adam's side as he slept, so the new Eve, the church, was born out of the side of Jesus as he hung upon the cross. As the Gospel of John describes, after Jesus had died, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. The blood and water, according to the church fathers, represent the sacraments of the church, especially the Eucharist, associated with the blood, and baptism, associated with the flowing water, that like Ezekiel's image of water flowing out of the temple gives life. St. Augustine, in making this connection, writes, and I quote, "Then came the soldiers and broke the legs of the first, and of the other who was crucified with them. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was dead already, they broke not his legs. But one of the soldiers, with a spear laid upon his side, and immediately came there out blood and water." A suggestive word was made use of by the evangelist, in not saying pierced or wounded his side or anything else, but opened, that thereby, in a sense, the gate of life might be thrown open, from whence have flowed forth the sacraments of the church, without which there is no entrance to the life which is the true life. That blood was shed for the remission of sins, that water it is that makes up the health-giving cup and supplies at once the laver, baptism, and water for drinking. This was announced beforehand, when Noah was commanded to make a door in the side of the ark, Genesis 6:16, whereby the animals might enter, which were not destined to perish in the flood, and by which the church was prefigured. Because of this, the first woman was formed from the side of the man when asleep, Genesis 2:22, and was called life and the mother of all the living, Genesis 3:20. Truly, it pointed to a great good prior to the great evil of the transgression, in the guise of one thus lying asleep. This second Adam bowed his head and fell asleep on the cross, that a spouse might be formed for him from that which flowed from the sleeper's side. O death, whereby the dead are raised anew to life, what can be purer than such blood? What more health-giving than such a wound?